So one topic that I actually really like in the logic section is investigating fallacies. So we'll start by looking at what a fallacy is. So a fallacy is an ambiguous, misleading, or unsound argument. And we run into fallacies all the time when we listen to people try to give arguments. And if you start to pay attention to these fallacies, you'll hear them happen all the time, and hopefully you won't be tempted to believe the incorrect argument. Now, there's three main types: formal fallacies, informal fallacies, and loaded questions. So those will occur when the formal rules of logic are distorted. When we say an informal fallacy, we're talking about when the content of an argument's premises fail to adequately support the conclusion. So one of the types of fallacy is the red herring. So I want you to take a look at this argument. The child says, "I need a new laptop to do my homework." The parent says, "When I was your age, we didn't even have calculators." So the argument that's going on here is that the parent is rejecting the idea of the child needing a laptop based on the premise that I didn't have a calculator when I was your age. But this is considered a red herring and is very commonly used. What happens in a red herring is that you attempt to introduce some sort of irrelevant part of the argument to distract the audience from the issue that's actually at hand. So in this case, the fact that the parent did not have a calculator growing up really is irrelevant to the child needing a laptop. Education today is different than the education would have been 20 or 30 years ago. But in this argument, this premise is being used to try to draw the focus from the child's request to a laptop, or from needing a laptop, to the parent not having a calculator in school. Another thing that you can think of is the red herring fallacy came from when hunting dogs would try to help the hunters locate the herrings. And sometimes the dogs would get off on an irrelevant scent and they would go somewhere other than where the herring was. And so it was called a red herring here when they veered off course and went towards something else. And that's what's happening in a red herring fallacy, is the argument is veering away from what's actually at hand. Another one that happens frequently is the hasty generalization. So here, two members of the tennis team improved their play after taking a yoga class. Therefore, we should have all members of the tennis team take a yoga class. Well, this is the hasty generalization because you're making a broad conclusion based on a relatively small sample. The premise here is that taking a yoga class improves tennis play. The conclusion is that all tennis players should take a yoga class to make the team better. Now, I'm not saying that the yoga class doesn't improve the tennis play, but because we're making this conclusion based on just a few observations, this is a hasty generalization. This is one that I encounter all the time when I read the news, because people will draw conclusions based on what they see 1, 2, or 3 people say or do. In these cases, you cannot know what an entire population would do based on just a few observations. We use this type of fallacy when you are trying to conclude something that's good for all if it's good for few. But logically, that is not a valid way to approach an argument. A third type is the loaded question fallacy. This is going to contain a loaded presumption, which is a question with a false or questionable presupposition. Take a look at this question. Have you told your girlfriend that you cheated on her? Well, here it's a question, so we can't really call this an argument, but it is an effort to trick somebody into an unintended implication. There's no real good way to answer this question, because any direct response implies a deniable statement or one that's downright false. If you say yes, he's implying that he's cheated on the girlfriend and he's told her. If he says no, then he's implying that he has cheated on his girlfriend, but he's yet to tell her. So you're asking a question that has absolutely no right answer, and that's called a loaded question. Another type of fallacy is this black or white fallacy, and we see these when there's only two options. And there's rarely a case when there's only two options that you would encounter. If someone gives you this black or white question, then you just reject it or refuse to answer, because very, very rarely are there only two options. One example of a black or white fallacy is something like this. You either support the president or you don't love America. Well, you can love America without supporting the president. You can support the president without loving America. Those are not the only two choices that you have in front of you. So be cautious of any time you are only given two options, because often there's at least one or many more options that you could follow. In your homework for this section, as well as in the textbook for this section, I encourage you to read through them and to look at some of these different fallacies. The textbook does a great job explaining them and giving you some examples, but if you find that some of them don't quite make sense, please reach out and I'd be happy to try to explain it to you. But there's a ton of fallacies, and you would find even more of them on the internet, but we're just going to focus on a small group that you'll find in your textbook in section 2.4.